Okay, hi everybody. It's Satsang. I was just letting a few of the folks know that we're going to start calling this the US edition. I'm going to start doing a Satsang. It's going to be a UK edition. It'll start August 28th. It's a little bit different time, but if you want to join, you can. I got on the line the other day to answer a 20 or 30-minute question with, I thought, 2 to 3 people, and 17 people were waiting for me. So I spoke for 2 hours, and so they actually want more. So we are scheduling with that group, and more probably along the way. But those will be on Fridays, and it'll be at around 9 o'clock my time. So it's going to be at 12 California time and 3 on the East Coast. But it's designed for the European crowd. It's an 8 p.m. start for them on a Friday night, and for some reason they like Friday night. Maybe that's their throwaway night. So welcome everybody. That will be the UK edition. So we'll have a US edition and a UK edition. So and one is the first and third, as you know, Thursdays, and the other one will be the second and fourth Fridays. So you'll be able to get a weekly version if you're in the mood. So I wanted to start today and just go over a little bit of just set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. Donovan has sent me some really great questions, which I'm going to read. And so our satsang's going to center around those questions. He was a bit concerned that they might not be great questions, and they're actually some of the best ones I've ever seen. So I'll read those to everyone. But I wanted to first of all just explain to you that, you know, what we are up to is talking always about the spiritual journey. And in the world today, a lot of people confuse what that journey is about. So if you look in our world, a lot of people are going to talk to you about energy and numbers and just a lot of different things. And those are all conflated or included in what people call the spiritual world. And that's just manifestation. That's what that is. It's what appears to us and what we see. We're part of that manifestation. And anything that has an esoteric or kind of a non-logical sense to it, but happen in front of us, that gets assigned to the spiritual. So very specifically, the spiritual journey is a journey of looking at identification. And it is the unraveling of the misidentification that we are all given. It's our birthright, comes with our mother's milk, that tells us that the ego that we build is who we are. So that means I'm Alan, I'm from Southern California. Ron was just on. Also, I believe a Californian from the get-go, but went a different route. He worked in real estate, so he's a real estate guy. And I have Donovan, who's from Oceanside. He's a surfer, and Dan's with him, and used to run a restaurant. He's an attorney, and then I've got Jim, and Jim used to work for IBM. He's kind of a corporate guy. So those are what we call story identities. That's what they are. And those story identities, when we think that's who we are, what we do is we say, oh, I'm an individual thing. I'm apart from everybody else. I've been given a name and, in fact, a story to go with it. Either I've created it or I've been helped to create it, but that's how I go around and describe who I am, so people know what this body-mind is as a story. And what we find out is that we go along, we start to feel what most people are going to call bondage. We know something's wrong. My particular story was I'm 35 or 6 years old. I've had a meteoric kind of corporate career. I've checked all the boxes that my parents and any other influence I had told me that I needed to do. And but somewhere internally, very deeply, I knew that there was something wrong. Now, I didn't know what that something wrong was. I just knew there was something wrong. And what that did is it pushed me into a seeking mission, if you will, or journey. And I began to kick the rocks over in life and say, well, like, what am I really? Is this really, what it is I am, and can that what it is I am, the story called Alan, be happy in any way, at peace? Because what I wouldn't have been able to say then and what I'm able to say now is that the turbulence of being a specific identity was blocking or getting in the way of any kind of inner peace. Now, why would I say that now? Because as I moved along, I began to find out that as awareness and consciousness itself in that position, permanent peace is the arising. It actually is our natural birthright, more natural than even the story that we start with, which I call the original myth story a lot, and we'll talk about that a little today. So that division, or that inner intuitive knowing, even though I could never explain it at the time, launched me into a very heat-seeking kind of experience of going to India, reading every book I could get my hands on, all of the things that I did. I did it in the particular way that Alan does things. It was right now a whole bunch. It was having a sip of water from a fire hose, and that's just how I've always done things. Not the most efficient way. A lot of water gets lost, but it's fun to watch for sure. So that's the journey. So whenever we indulge in talking about the stories outside or the world outside or the rest of it, while those might be emanations or arisings within consciousness, and they might be mysterious, and they might have to do with the energy of consciousness that we don't know, they aren't part and parcel of the spiritual journey. They are, a lot of times they can be gifts. In India, they talk about spiritual people having what they call siddhis, or gifts. And in the US, we see people that can read energy or do a lot of these things. Now, I want you to know, there are no gifts over here. So if your version of spirituality includes that the person who was speaking to you about it has some gifts, Santa's bag is empty. This isn't the place for that. Probably the only gift that's on offer here is the experience of having walked through a spiritual journey and the arrival at a place where the insight and the clarity of what that is can be spoken about. So to that degree, there is a gift, but I don't speak in tongues, and I don't see things in the air, and personages don't visit me. So that I know that would make me a huge disappointment to a lot of the spiritual community. I probably couldn't even get an entrance pass into Santa Monica for that matter. But the spiritual journey is a journey of finding out who you are. That is the journey. Now there are a lot of ways to do that, but that's the journey. So one of the things that I use a lot of times is I say, just let's start at the beginning. Do we really know what this I that we talk about is? Because here's what I'm going to tell you. We live as if we do. We certainly do. But science and all of the areas where study is done and research is done will tell you that we're still making it up what it is. Does the I that Alan is, does it exist within the outlines of this body? Or does it have something that extends out here? Does it have an aura? Does it have this other thing that goes out there? And is that part of the Alan thing, or is that actually consciousness? Does everything that happens in terms of what comes into the body, mind, the Alan story, is that held in here? We always say it is, right? We go, oh, it's in the brain. But then we start to find out that there's things called like archetypal stories, and everybody seems to have those. They can access those. And there are lots of things that seemingly live outside of what you and I might define what we are, but they're clearly not in there. They're somewhere else. So it's pretty clear we don't know what an I even is. You couldn't tell me. They're still making that up. They're still doing research, and the best that they can do is tell you, well, this is who you are, the best we can find it. Now, we know that that's incredibly underfilled, the basket, because there's going to be a lot more we're going to find out about who you are. But in the meantime, take what you have and act like that's who you are. So we'll among us will agree as to what an I is. And so we say, okay, well, an I is the story that walks around. It has the autonomous capability of creating its own journey, making its own decisions. It achieves things. What it gets is what it's created. The Allen story must be pretty industrious because he's created lots of stuff, and as a result, has a few things, you know. Actually, all the stories in this meeting here, all of us, you know, live in that wonderful place of having a few things. So I guess we're all really great achievers, but are we really? Do we even know where the achieving comes from? So I came up with this pointer to kind of point at that, and I call it multiply by zero. And what it is I always say, well, you know, think about how math works. You can take a whole set of numbers and you can multiply them. 6 times 6 is 36. 5 times 5 is 25. You can go 6 and 6 times 5, and you end up with 180. That's, you know, that's you know, the 6 times 30 kind of thing. So all of these numbers are really, really great. But you all got, everybody here in this particular group had a math class when they were pretty young. So what happens when you put a zero in there? It reduces the whole thing to zero. You can do a multiplication problem for as long as you want. And when you are done, if you put a zero in there, the answer is zero. Doesn't matter what all the rest of the numbers are. Then the result is zero. So, do we really know who we are? Because what we do is we act as if we are all a set of numbers in a multiplication formula. But I would tell you that what happens if it turns out that the ego that you think you are doesn't really exist? What if that's a zero? What does that reduce who you are to? Nothing. Outside chance of that. So I put a little quote up here before everybody got on, and it says, you are the perceiving point, the non-dimensional source of all dimensions. Now that's just so you know, that came from Nisargadatta Maharaj, who is very close to the work I do. Ramesh Balsekar, who was my mentor, was his translator, and very close to him. And so Nisargadatta lives in my world. He was very famous for a book called I Am That. But if you were doing math and I told you that there were all sorts of dimensional sources, and I put a non-dimensional source in there, a perceiving point, but the perceiving point that had no dimension, what would that reduce that formula to? And what could we say about all of the dimensions then? Because all of the dimensions would simply be zero. So this is Nisargadatta's version of my multiply by zero. So here's where we get to, and the reason I wanted to start there was we start as this perceiving point, and that perceiving point is within a body-mind. So that perception happens through the body-mind by consciousness itself. But then what do we add to it? We add a story to it. Now, I use the term original myth story, and all that is the natural way that the body mind that you are would behave once rendered into a story. So once you take it and you make it into a story, that's an original myth story. So the purity of how you arrive and who you are will render itself into a story, because the intellects, now remember, how does a story happen? We look out there and we see everything that is. We pull pieces, and that's called cognition, by the way. So cognition is a fancy word for taking something out of everything you see. Pretty simple. And then we assemble that in our mind. Now, you all know that we can construct in our mind because all of you can construct a story. How hard is that? So the construction of a story happens where? It happens in the mind. Now, the confusion that happens in humanity is we start to say, oh, that intellectually constructed story is who I am. And within your mind, you start to back that up with everything that you see until the loop is closed and that story becomes the who you believe you are. And that's what a story is. So there's your introduction for today to get to Donovan's questions. By the way, if you have any questions as we go along, pop them into the chat or I'll open you up and you can ask it personally. And I'm guessing since Donovan sent these to me, he's not dying to get up here and actually do the chat. So I'm just going to do his questions, and then we'll see if he actually wants to jump in. If he does, he's certainly welcome to. So the first question he asked was the relationship between free will or no free will and manifesting personal doership. An example: I recently quit drinking coffee, even though I was physically addicted to it. It seemed like I used my will and intent to accomplish that. Now that's his first question. Tell me about free will and personal doership. In other words, does it take free will to accomplish what looks to be a personal goal or event? Now, I'm going to read the other questions because they'll weave together. So the second question is, when you talk about story, should one create their ideal story? Not believe in a story? Have a different story for different roles in life? So that's question 2, which is a story question. And then the third one is source, universe, God personal or impersonal? Another great question. So let me just play with those 3 questions. I'll weave those in and out, and then we'll see if we arrive somewhere where everybody can understand what I'm up to. So I always start with the place where I say a story, and a story of who you are, is something that you have intellectually constructed and lives in your mind. That's where it lives. And what happens is, as the body mind and all the body minds and all the events happen around us, the mind assembles the story that goes with it. So the things that you see arise do happen out there. And then a story is added to that. It's almost like a soundtrack. So the soundtrack called I am an individual ego that is living a story in this world is added to the movement that you see. So even if you walk out and you see a pig run across my pasture here, you would say something really intelligent like, hey, look, the pig is running across the pasture. Now, I don't know if you get that when I say the pig is running across the pasture that I've created a story. It's a very short one. Started with the pig, I saw the pig, ended with the pig, he ran across the pasture. Pretty quick story. Not a moral to it. Probably wouldn't interest a whole lot of folks, but it's a story. It is a story piece. But you seeing that pig run across that pasture and I saying to you the pig is running across the pasture are 2 completely different things. When I say to you the pig ran across the pasture, you don't even need to be here. Oh, there's a story in there. And you might even fill in what you think it looked like. You probably won't even come close because you know how that works. You can't imagine the pasture or the pig or anything in between, but you can imagine a pasture and a pig and create the story in your head. And all that is a mind construction. That's what's happened. You've created that in your mind. But the pig that ran across the pasture, that long ago happened. It arose, it happened, it was noted and a story was created, and then it was held in the mind. So there's a very famous quote that says, all we really know is that we exist. In other words, we have a sense of existence. That's what we know. And all of the rest of it is interpretation. Why is it interpretation? Well, it's a constructed story. So you go, well, wait a minute, Alan, anybody who sees a pig runs across a pasture is going to say the pig ran across the pasture. That sounds like a story that kind of everybody can get right. Okay, sure. I'll go with you to that point. But take a look at how life really happens. You know, we got this guy right now that's running the country, the U.S. right now, and I swear that people tell really different stories about the exact same thing that they see. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it really seems like the story, because the fellow gets up, speaks, does what he does, and sits back down, gets up in the morning and does it again. And these wildly different stories about what's happening seem to get reflected. And not only that, there's a lot of them in between too. When you look out there, you're going to find out that those are just interpretations. Those stories are constructed and they're interpretations. So even the Alan story, Alan was a CPA. Yeah, they gave me a certificate. Alan was a good CPA. Hey, you know, some people thought so, but I'm going to guess there's a few that probably didn't think he was all that great at that. Alan was an athlete. Some people go a good one. Some people will say a bad one. And so the pig running across the pasture starts to take on a whole variety of possibilities in the construction of the story. And so do we really know what we are when we construct a story? I'm going to say likely not, but the spiritual search is to find out who you really are. And I would say who you really are is awareness and consciousness. Those are the two things that you really are. And that the rest of it is held in the mind. So Donovan, I want you to think about that. When I talk about story, where does the story exist? Right? And you'll always go, oh, I get it. The story exists in the mind. That's really where it exists, right? So then comes the question of free will and personal doership. Well, how do these things happen? Well, the story actually gets made up to go with what's happening. But the natural version of who you are is living itself on the stage of existence itself. That's actually what's going on. So, but what we like to believe, what the ego wants to believe, is that now all the ego is, by the way, is the animation of that story. So consciousness is really kind of a cool thing. It goes with the flow. So if you believe that you are a story, it's lighting you up and you get to be that story, and your ego gets to be the as if or the thing that you think you are. So that's your living understanding. So we all have a living understanding of what the story is. If, however, you work with your spiritual path, there comes a moment where the world shifts and your perception, you become this perceiving point, the non-dimensional perceiving point. And you see, oh, the ego and all of that story really is just a creation. And that becomes your living understanding. Because even when you speak of it, you're going to render that into a story. So what's the importance of story? The importance of story is using it to create an outcome or an exit from the misidentifications of other stories. And ultimately, that you and I and everyone will actually stand in consciousness. We will be consciousness itself. So what makes what we're doing here different from what we normally do? Because when we say, does somebody have free will or don't they? They're going, dude, this is a yes or a no question. And I say, well, it's a yes or no question about a story that lives where? It lives in your mind. So does it really matter whether a story has free will or whether it doesn't? They go, yeah, but Alan, like, if it doesn't really matter, then why are you always telling me that there's no free will? And here's why. There's a famous story about the old master of teaching children how to ride bicycles. The entire country knew that this man, he was really something. And So if you ever needed any help with one of the kids and teaching them how to ride the bike, this particular old fellow was the guy. You'd go say, hey, come help me. Well, it became kind of talked about, in this particular country, and people started to say, you know what, we really never see what he does with these kids. There must be a way that he's doing that. So we need to kind of stay aware. Let's watch and see what he does, because maybe we can pick up how it is that he's teaching these kids how to ride a bike. Well, as it turned out, one day in the main town of the country, the master was coming to teach an 11-year-old boy how to ride a bike. And so everybody found out where it was going to be, and they all got there, and they were watching, from a distance, and to see how this master handled it, And here's what they saw. They saw this young child on a bike, and they saw this old man, and he would ride on the bike, and the old man would chase behind him, and he would yell, lean to the left, lean to the left. Huh, pretty cool. So they watched that for about an hour, and they go, yeah, I think we got this thing, So the next day in the newspaper of the country, secret of the bike master exposed, lean to the left. The key to riding a bike is leaning to the left. What did they miss? Well, here's what they missed. They missed the fact that the child he was teaching leaned to the right. And the way to get him to that place called balance was to tell him to lean to the left. And what they did is they said, oh my goodness, lean to the left is the answer. Lean to the left is the answer. So what's that? How does that apply to what I'm talking about? Well, I'm 67 years old, and most everybody on the call, Donovan's actually the young guy here. All of the participants on this particular call, we've been around a while. Now, we have led an entire life where we believe that we have free will. So we lean really to the free will side, way to the free will side. In fact, we got to be really careful so that the pedals don't scrape the ground. We are so leaning that far, because that's really what we base everything on. So the bike master comes along, and he's running behind, and he's going, lean to the left, lean to the left. There's no free will, right? The point of that is that it is a pointer. It's a teaching pointer. And what happens is it is a doorway to standing in consciousness itself, because when the believer of the story of free will begins to let it be that there is no free will, then they begin to feel that consciousness lives them. And that's the perceiving from the non-dimensional source. It feels as though you are being lived. And the feeling of bondage that you have because you believe you're an individual completely disappears, in the sense that you are simply perfectly lived into every moment. That's the way I say it. Now, that's a story, because the experience of that, the felt experience of that, really is outside of words. So why is it that I say there's no free will, and a lot of the teachers will tell you there's no free will? They're trying to tell you to lean to the left. And do I know whether there's free will or whether there isn't? Couldn't tell you. But I'm going to guess that in a world of awareness and consciousness only, that emerges all as one thing. And when I say one thing, it's not even a thing. It emerges. That there likely is just the emergence itself in the moment that the emergence happens. And that the only place that free will, or the story of no free will, can really exist is in the mind itself. Now, I hope I haven't lost you guys there, but that's where this one lives. That's where the free will piece comes in. It's a pointer. So all the guys are sitting around in their Chase lounges near the pool, and someone starts to say, let's talk about water being wet, and they have a large discussion about that. And somebody who is clear that the conversation about water being wet doesn't even come close to the experience of the wetness of water comes up and pushes one of the fellows into the water. Now, who understands what water being wet is the best out of all of that crowd? the one that got pushed in the water, right? But when they talk about being wet, they're creating a story about it. The being wet was the experience of actually falling in the water or being pushed into the water in this case. So that's all we're doing here, is that when you speak of reclaiming or coming back to the consciousness that you are and having that be a part of the journey, with you arising within that consciousness, that is being pushed into the pool. So when you talk to people like me, we'll talk about free will, but we're going to tell you, don't really know whether there's free will and not or not. I sort of suspect that there's neither, but I will use it as a pointer so that the experience of what I just said can be something that could happen to you. So it's a push into the water. That's what that's about, Donovan. It's a push into the water, and talking about whether it really exists or not is interesting, but all of that lives in a story and in the mind. Great. So when you talk about story, so I'm going to go to your next story question, because story is really important. And the reason it ends up being important is that the journey is a march back to who you are originally. Who is your original face? They say that sometimes. Who am I? When you ask the question, who am I? When you ask it in your mind, it's a question about who am I? So you're going, who is the Alan story? But the question, the real question's intended to live an experience, which is, what am I as consciousness? So that's why the question even gets asked. However, there is that crossover point where, as a human being, the individuation or the separate version of who you are gets established. In the East, they call that the I am. In the West, I call it the original myth story. It's the perfect story of who you are as perfect consciousness. That's what that original myth story is. Then what happens is that story is taken and it's bastardized. You get all sorts of helpful things from your church, your teachers, your parents, all of those folks that think that they're individual folks, and what they need to do is install a bunch of software and operating instructions in this separate entity. And so, and you need to do things that they think you need to do. You need to believe in God. If you're a Catholic, I guess you do the rosary and and all of that. Who knows what it includes, but because yours and mine would be different, but it kind of holds the same categories. It's what you should do, how you should do it, all of that stuff, how you should think. And as I said, there's wide varieties on how people think that ought to happen, but that's what happens. So you get bastardized, and so you become something that is way usually distant from what that original myth story would have been, right? So the only reason that original myth story is important is that the idea is that if one could march back and actually embrace the original essence of who you are, that one is one step away from recognizing the consciousness that established, or that had that perfect energy arise as consciousness in a body mind. And that's just part of the walk back. And it's so much a part of the walk back that when you get there, people will say, oh, welcome home. In other words, you've returned to what you originally were. That original essence lives in you. And the woulds and coulds and shoulds have simply, some of them may continue to affect you, but they've fallen off in terms of you believing that's who you are. So should one create their ideal story? No, actually, that story will live there perfectly. And if you flip the switch, it'll happen. You'll be lived. Consciousness will live you. So the journey back is actually one of finding that original story, working your way to where you know exactly who you are as a story, right? Now, beyond that, who you are is simply awareness itself. That's all it is. It's simply awareness itself, and it has no particular flavor to it. It's just you're the non-perceiving or the perceiving point. You're non-dimensional in a world of dimensions. All right. So So here comes a nice question, everybody. Actually, it came to me privately, but I'll read it again. It says, is standing in the door of consciousness like being in the flow? Yes. So being in the flow is that feel that you're being lived into the perfect place, and there is no sense that you are doing anything. And everybody knows that. Donovan knows this. A surfer on a wave feels the felt experience, and it's only later they go onto shore and they go, here, let me tell you what I did. The pig ran across the pasture, right? In other words, that moment of perfect flow gets migrated into a story that lives in your head. And that's not what happened out there. That moment of perfect flow is not the story that you're telling about it. It's the best you can do to point to it or let somebody know that happened. But that moment of perfect flow is exactly what I'm talking about. So when I say you feel like you are lived into the moment, that's a feeling of consciousness itself. And when that feeling is always present, it takes the place of the feeling that you're doing something. Only one of those can be happening at any one point in time. So all of this journey is to move you into that place where you feel like that's what's happening to you. And the story is just what you create that you talk about, but we believe that it's actually what's happening. So I don't know if you see that we've taken this piece of intellectual stuff and we act as though it's real. And that's really what I'm trying to get at. And what I'm trying to do is split those two things apart so that the consciousness or in the flow stuff can happen. And the story's fine. If the story continues to get created, that's fine, but you don't believe that's who you are. You know that's not you, or you go, oh, that's that made up piece that I tell when I need to tell. So if one body mind talks to another, I go, oh, Alan, here's the story of Alan. Great. Now you know that. But that's not really when you're around Alan. Alan isn't all of that stuff. When I'm sitting with Dan Calloway, one of my closest friends who's on the call right now, I know Dan's not running through the metrics of Alan's story. He's not going, okay, well, Alan went here and he did that and he was this and he was that. Dan's not thinking that. Dan and I are just sitting there, right? It's a moment that arises. Those stories aren't even present in that moment. And then if we want to talk about that moment, guess what we do? We create a story, right? So you don't need to create your ideal story if you just simply live authentically and perfectly in each moment. The story that gets told is going to be a story about that, right? So that's how that is. Do you want to believe in a story? Can't. As I say, the best you're going to do is construct a story that's going to be kind of close, I would imagine. You watch people go around all the time and they get upset by what somebody else says about them. And let me tell you the big moment that can happen for you if you let it. You have no control over what anybody else constructs as a story about you. Zero, nada, zip. Because that's being constructed over there based on whatever that body, mind, and its intellect is creating. That's story creation. So what do? We go around and we talk to people. You can go into a restaurant, a couple of 50 years is sitting there, and the old fellow's telling his wife who he is. Now, you don't think that woman after 50 years has got kind of a clue? I think she does, right? And yet, his big concern is that he tells his story in a way that what he perceives that she thinks it is matches what he wants it to be. That's how most people spend their entire life. Let me tell you who I am. Oh, no, you got it wrong. Let me tell you I really am. No, you got it wrong. Let me tell you I really am. That's what life is, right? It's an exercise in stories. So you don't necessarily need to believe in story, but you need to understand that stories are a huge part of how life is lived. And when you deal with somebody, you meet them where they are. So why do I always talk about story? Because it's the place that I can meet people so that they understand what the next step is in a spiritual journey. That's all I'm doing, right? So when somebody says to me, hey, Alan, I will never let go of this idea that I have free will. I'm like, great, well, let's work with that. Let's pretend you have free will and we'll work with the other pieces. Because all we're trying to do is dissolve the pieces. And then one day someone sends me a note and says, wait a minute, the free will thing I told you that I was all stuck to, now I want to talk about it because maybe that's got to play in this thing. because I'm thinking that if I believe that that story has free will, that somehow it stops me from moving to where my movement wants to go. Now, the whole thing is that consciousness inside you pulls you through all of that, Donovan. So you don't need to believe in a story. All you have to do is follow the pull, the magnetism that lives in you. It's going to pull you right to it. So understanding that we're all dealing in stories and knowing that those stories really aren't who we are. Even the original myth story is created from the perfect energy that you arrive as. Right? That's all. So back through that place is where we're trying to go. So do you have a different story for different roles in life? We all do, right? You know, you're 18 years old, you meet a cute girl, you know, what are you going to do? Tell her about your plumbing career? Probably not, right? You're going to tell her something else, right? This is a hot girl, you know, she's attractive. You want to tell her a story that works for that, you know? The next day you show up and you get into work at 9 a.m. and your boss wants you to go climb on the roof and put a TV antenna up, and you're like going, okay, I need a story for this. What's my role in this case? That's different than the hot girl I met the night before. So I'm not going to be telling these two people the same story. Those are different roles. So yeah, we do that. We understand how to communicate in stories for the moment that arises. So, you know, but who you are, believe it or not, is always the same thing. So think for a minute. Can you remember when you were 5 and you remember right now? Can you feel the sameness of being involved? Aren't you find the part of you that's exactly the same. I remember when I was 5, I'm now 67. I'm here, right? I'm here. That I'm here, that I exist is always the same. It doesn't matter how old you are. It's the same. I'm here. I'm right here. That's the sense of existence. That's the one thing we know. I'm here. The changeless thing that we know. Who were you before you were born? I'm here. Who were you after you die? I'm here. In the moment, right here and now. No intellectual stuff that lives in the past or the future. There is no past and future in non-dimensional worlds. There's only right here and right now. So the story that you live, believe it or not, you don't even think about that story. You just simply are lived. You're in the flow. And then the story that gets made up by you, anyone, is whatever that story is, right? It becomes the story that we make up. What good is that story? It's good to get us back to the place where we see that we're not a story, ultimately. That's what it's good for. Right? So that's how pointers work. We create something in our mind and we think that that's who we are. And then what we're trying to do is use a pointer to dissolve that thinking that lives in there that tells us something that just simply isn't the case. And the only way seemingly to get to where one has dissolved that story and feels something different is to get the dissolution to happen, because it obscures, it obfuscates, it hides the real consciousness that you are. Why does the world think we're a bunch of egos? Because the egos are so big as a story that the consciousness that lives behind it, upon which the ego actually lives, is hidden. You don't see it. All you think there are egos. There's no consciousness in that world. All there are egos. And you can see that on display every day. So that's that part of it. And then the last question is source, universe, God. Here's the way I'm going to go ahead and add to this because I use certain terms. So awareness is who you ultimately are. And consciousness is the element of change. So awareness is changeless. So when I said you were always there, I wasn't speaking about consciousness per se. I was speaking of the awareness, the non-dimensional awareness that hides behind consciousness and sees through consciousness itself. So in a way, what's really happening here is every one of us is simply being lived by consciousness in every moment. It's the what you're seeing, the perceiving is being perceived by consciousness itself. It's as though consciousness has its hand up your butt and is perceiving on behalf of awareness. So the awareness is perceiving through the movement of consciousness, right? But there's no Alan other than the story of Alan happening. It's just a perfect arising or a perfect happening. So in the Gita, when Arjuna goes to Krishna and says, I don't want to go fight my brothers, he goes, don't worry about it. It's already done. That's happened. Why does he say that? Well, because he knows that that's exactly what's going to happen, right? It's already happened. Don't fret about it. Let it go. He's telling Arjuna, drop what's in the mind and let what happens. And in this case, the fighting of your brothers and relatives, that's going to be on tap because he phrases it in a way, hey, it's already happened. What does that do as a pointer? It relieves Arjuna of worrying about the past and the future. Takes him completely out of those two places, out of the conceptual mind. That's what that story says. Okay. So let's talk about that. So I use awareness and consciousness, the element of changelessness and the element of change. Those two put together are life as we understand it. That's the construction. That's the construction of life, if you will. Now that's a concept, right? The experience of it doesn't even equate to the words I say, but I'm using that as a pointer to point towards. If I were to tell you from a story standpoint, what's the story of awakening? Well, there's awareness and consciousness. That's how I would tell you the story. So you say, is source, universe, God? And all of those are exactly the same thing. I mean, those are the combination of those two things that I just said. So is it personal or impersonal? So here's where it gets a little dicey, and here's why. Because when we say something is impersonal, it feels as though it's not human, or it feels as though it's not connected in a vibrant and robust way to us, right? So I don't want you to think that consciousness doesn't have a personal feel, even though it's not located in a person, right? So the answer to your question is, it's impersonal, right? It is as though we were all can openers, and in order for us to operate, we need to plug the plug into the wall, and the electricity that is delivered, which is the essence of humanity and robustness and activity and change, right, flows into the can opener, and the can opener now operates. Great. Awesome. But is that personal or impersonal? Well, it's impersonal, even though it feels incredibly personal, because it's the essence of this sense of I am in and of itself. In fact, without that, what do they do with the can opener? Well, like can openers, they throw in the trash. You and I, they put us in an urn or a box or something along that line. But a dead body is as good as a broken can opener in that particular way. So no electricity, no consciousness, it all goes away, right? So when we talk about personal, and all we're talking about is the fact that each person is a separate thing, source, universe, and God are not separate things. They fuel the whole thing. In that way, they're impersonal, but they don't feel impersonal. So there's just a little bit of I just want to point that out, because people really have a hard time with the personal and the impersonal, because when you say that something's impersonal, it feels like it's not human. It feels like it doesn't contain all of the beautiful pieces of life itself. And yet that's actually what it is. Without that, those other things can't happen. So just notice that when you and I use personal and impersonal, we're not trying to imply that personal is something that feels juicy and nourishing, and impersonal feels, not so much. That's just not the case. All right, so those are the questions that Donovan asked, and I'm hoping I didn't get too far afield. It's not the easiest set. He actually asked a set of questions that kind of holds the entirety of the journey, if you think about it. And I know what I've said is probably a lot to hold. If you stop and kind of hold each piece of this, you'll be able to get your arms around it as you go. All right. Is there anything else? Are there any questions that anybody has? Is there an unmuting that wants to happen, or a question that someone wants to post? And if there is, I will be happy to engage in that. Yeah. Pretty cool. Huh. All right. I actually, believe it or not, I'm 54 minutes in or whatever it is, and I feel like I bit off a pretty big bite tonight. So I think the last thing I want to leave you with is everything that we talk about is simple. It can be reduced to simplicity. So when we talk about things like the personal and impersonal, manifesting, doership, there are actually a lot of times much easier ways to maybe say all of that. And so those words become shorthand for something simpler that lives underneath. So as you listen to me speak, and as you know, I'm a fast speaker and I roll through these things, don't get the impression that what we're talking about is complicated or difficult. The reason it may feel that way is this. When you are created as a story, you create a platform and everything gets located on that platform. So everything that comes in gets put on that story cognition platform. It gets cognized, pulled out, placed on the platform of story, and creates a story. That's what happens, right? So the thing is, we don't have anywhere in that story platform for us to be not an autonomous creator or author of our own journey. We don't have that. So I just want to say it's really pretty simple. The reason sometimes you don't get it is there's no place on your platform to hold it. And it feels like, and you assign that to, oh, that's too complicated to understand. It's not what's going on. So as you run into that, raise your hand and ask, because those are the questions. That's what Donovan did tonight. All right, guys, I think that's it for tonight. I love you all. It's been a real blast. I will see you in a couple of weeks. By the way, as I said earlier, there will be a UK edition starting on August 28th. It's earlier in the day. Feel free to jump into that group. It's a fun group with a lot of interesting accents, and it's delightful to talk to the folks from the UK, even though there's a lot of folks from other places in the mix, Europe as well. So feel free to jump into that. This one will keep going. So we'll have our US edition and our UK edition. So till the next time, much love. Send me questions if you want to, like Donovan did ahead of time. Come in and post them. Ready to answer them. All right, guys, to the next time. Have fun.